Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Healthcare AI Forum. And my name is Yuan. I'm the host of the forum. Today is my great pleasure to introduce Emma Croxford, who is a PhD candidate in biomedical data science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research is primarily focused on the evaluation of large language model-generated clinical text, with emphasis on the development of robust evaluation workflows for ensuring clinical safety without sacrificing the quality of assessment. And today she's going to talk about LLM as a judge, automating and scaling generative AI evaluations in medicine. Emma, please get on the stage.
Thank you. All right. As Jen said, I'm Emma, and today we're going to be talking about our work leading up to and including large language model as a judge. So to get started, imagine you're a specialist clinician and you have a new patient that shows up. So this patient maybe has been to multiple clinicians before seeing you, might have been in and out of the hospital, and so they have quite a lot of documentation that's associated with them. And so you want to use this new service in your EHR that will use ChatGPT to summarize that medical history for the relevant information that you need for this particular visit. The problem is how can you trust that that summary is useful, it's accurate, and then it's not missing any current important details? So the current conundrum is that this technology is becoming more and more available, but there's not necessarily a standard way to automatically evaluate the qualities of these summaries. And so health systems want to use these new AI tools because they can help save clinicians time, but they don't want to put anything out that is unsafe or that might cause any additional harm to the patient. Now, human evaluation is usually the gold standard, but that's very time and resource intensive. And if the goal is to save clinicians time, adding more things that require their time doesn't help. So we look toward automating this, but traditional automated metrics fall short in capturing accuracy, coherence, and clinical relevance. And so what we need going forward is both transparent and rigorous validation, but also it needs to assess the criteria that we see with large language models. So there's weaknesses that traditionally come up include hallucination. So if there's a fabrication or a falsification of the information, omissions, the need for revision, faithfulness or confidence, bias, harm, groundedness or fluency. And then they also tend to struggle with multi-document longitudinal tasks. And so we want to take all these things into account when we're doing evaluation. And so first, in order to address some of these issues, we developed the Provider Documentation Summarization Quality Instrument, or the PDS-QI-9. And so throughout this presentation, there'll be little QR codes in the corners. Those will correspond to the papers that I'm discussing. And then at the end, I'll have one for our public GitLab repo that discusses all of this content. So feel free to scan that at any time throughout the presentation. So the Provider Documentation Summarization Quality Instrument is a human evaluation instrument that we developed to evaluate multi-document summarization. And so the goal here is to develop a really quality gold standard that is very transparent and that has a really good rigorous validation for this task. So in order to do this, we went through a fairly rigorous development process, including domain identification. So we reviewed evaluation methods that are currently in the literature, identified LLM-specific challenges to determine what aspects are important when you're doing an evaluation. We then worked on developing the instrument using multiple stakeholders from UW Health, Epic, and the University of Wisconsin and the University of Colorado, and then iterated to refine the scoring rubrics, both the definitions of the different dimensions that we're talking about, as well as how you're actually evaluating. And so most of these are going to be on 5-point Likert scales. And so you have to define each point on that Likert scale. We then took a lot of time in rater preparation, so developing standardized training protocols for our human evaluators and pilot testing with a set of exemplars. And then finally, we did a validation study using multiple validity assessments, including content validity, construct validity, and then we also did a lot of reliability and consistency testing, and those are the metrics that I'll present further. So the instrument ended up with 9 attributes, which is why it's called the PDS-QI-9. Those attributes include accuracy, citedness, comprehensible, succinct, stigmatizing, organized, synthesized, thorough, and useful, each of which presents a different dimension on which a summary needs to have a high quality in order to be considered good enough for care further on. And so these include things like just factual accuracy as well as linguistic quality. And then in addition, if it's logically organized, if it has complete information, and if it's clinically relevant to the provider who is going to be viewing that summary. So one example of a rubric item, so this is an example for the accuracy item, and the goal here is just to show that we put a lot of depth into all of the information that's included. So all of the text on the left is the description that the reviewer would see when they're doing this evaluation, and then on the right is the 5-point Likert scale and the definitions for each of those points. So I just really want to hone in here on the descriptions themselves are very, very important to this process, and this is where we spend a lot of our time in order to make sure that we were iterating through this so that it was understandable and that we're not relying on the clinician's internal knowledge of what these words might mean or what they think a 1 is and what they think a 5 is, so that we can really standardize it across raters and hopefully in additional testing later on across institutions. So in order to test this rubric, we pulled data for summarization from the UW Health EHR from March 2023 to December 2023. And so we're using real EHR data in our validation tests. We're generating these summaries from the perspective of a provider at an outpatient encounter. And this provider could be from one of 11 different specialties, including gynecology, neurology, dermatology, and so forth. The summaries are generated using the 3 to 5 encounters prior to that encounter that they're going to be going to, and that will include the multi-document EHR. We ended up pulling 200 unique patients for which we generated summaries. These summaries were generated using a large language model. The prompt given here is what the large language model was given. So you're an expert doctor. Your task is to write a summary for the specialty and after reviewing the notes from the patient. The LLM was prompted using one of 2 different chains of thought. And so that is either to generate higher quality summaries, it's aligned with the rubric on what would be good. And then to generate low quality summaries, we asked it to purposefully make things up, purposefully misclude information in order to have a good quality of summaries, because we want to test all aspects of the rubric, not just the 4 and 5 points. And so in addition, we also generated these summaries using 3 different large language models, a GPT-4o, Mixtral 8.7b, and Llama 3.8b, again, to get a diversity in the quality of the summary itself. When we're doing the validation study design, we were able to recruit 7 physician raters, 5 of which were junior physicians, so they had 1 to 5 years of postgraduate experience. In addition, we had 2 senior physicians who had 10 plus years of experience. And then, as I described before, we standardized training across these physicians using exemplar cases, which was additionally adjudicated by the 3 physicians who had clinical informatics experience that were part of our team. We did a priori calculations for statistical power in order to maintain our goal of 80% power, which we found required a minimum of 84 evaluations per rater when we thought we would only be able to get 5 raters. We were able to achieve this statistical power because we were able to get over 100 evaluations per rater over 7 raters. So in total, we had nearly 800 summaries evaluated and over 8,000 individual attribute scores across all evaluations. What we found in our outcome is that we were able to validate the instrument showing excellent validity for clinical use because of a high inter-rater reliability, which we measured using the interclass correlation coefficient, which achieved 0.867, as well as internal consistency, which we measured using Cronbach's alpha and achieved a 0.879. If you're not familiar with either of those metrics, they are both measured on a 0 to 1 scale, so closer to 1 is what we'd want and is better. So our outcome for this particular project was a tool built using a semi-Delphi process, which is the 4-step process I described before on real-world multi-site EHR data. So now that we've established this sort of ground truth or a high-quality human evaluation that we've shown good validity on, we want to then move on to our next step, which is to to automate the process. And we do this using what we call PDSQI9 LLM-as-a-Judge. And so what we found during that validation study is that it takes a single clinician almost 10 minutes to do one evaluation of one summary. And so that's not feasible if we want to scale this up to the whole health system. So the next step then is, how do you automate this process? We did this 4 different tests in this way. The first, the benchmark, which I'm going to call doctor as a judge, is using the human evaluation with a clinician. We then are going to look at using a single large language model as a judge, fine-tuning or training that large language model as a judge, and then using multiple large language models as judges. So these are the 4 settings that we are going to test in order to automate this workflow. So first, let's start with single large language model as a judge, which, if you're familiar, we'll just be using 0 and few shot methodology. So the input to the large language model as a judge is the exact same input that the human reviewer would have seen. And so this includes the raw patient notes, the patient summary, the entire PDSQI-9 rubric, including the descriptions and the 5-point Likert scales and their descriptions. And then for the large language model specifically, we have a couple task instructions. And so that is to guide the large language model to produce the output in a way that is easy to parse for later work. By the numbers, we had the notes all together, so that 3 to 5 notes that are being summarized. We had a median of 3,000 words for those notes. And then the summaries that were generated from those notes had a median of 328 words. So altogether, the length of the input to the large language model has a median of just under 5,000 words. We tested this using a whole bunch of different models, both open and closed source. So our closed source models, we use Microsoft Azure. And this is a specific HIPAA compliant instance here at UW Health, so that none of this patient data is going back to OpenAI or anything like that. And we're looking at GPT-4o, GPT-o3 Mini, and the DeepSeek R1 761 billion. These were the top of the line at the time that this project was done. And then when we're doing our open source evaluation, we're using models from Hugging Face, and these models are all being downloaded onto our on-premise HIPAA compliant servers. So again, we wanted to make sure we were being very safe with the PHI. These models included Llama 3.18 billion, Phi, Mixtral, and some of the DeepSeek distilled models. What we found is when you give all that information to the large language model and ask it to complete the evaluation, you get a pretty good level of interclass correlation coefficient, which again is the inter-rater reliability between this large language model and the ground truth of the humans. And so we're comparing, if you iterate over the large language model a couple times and then take the median across those, and then if you take the median from our 7 human reviewers, that's what we're comparing here to see, does the large language model agree with humans at least as much as humans agree with humans? Because again, we wouldn't expect a perfect correlation coefficient. We just want to get to the same level as we see amongst the humans. And so what we found is that amongst all these different 0 and few shots that we did across the different models, GPT-o3 Mini was able to achieve a strong level of inter-rater reliability at a 0.818 and had a median difference in the raw score of 0. And so that's the actual Likert 1 to 5. Following this, we then did testing on actually training the large language models. And so we did 2 different training methods. That is supervised fine-tuning and a reinforcement learning method. So supervised fine-tuning is showing the model examples of inputs and desired outputs. And then reinforcement learning, the model gets feedback on which responses are preferred and updates according to that. And so each step on this training is intended to make the model more aligned with how humans evaluate the quality. And so what that looks like, so for those familiar with supervised fine-tuning or reinforcement learning, here is how we set up the prompt and the response for that. So again, the prompt is the same, the notes, the summary, the rubric, and the task instructions. That is given to the large language model, and then the response that is considered correct, or the one that it should aim for, is the response from our humans. And so we have these in JSON string format where each of the rubric items has the associated Likert scale score. Then for our reinforcement learning, we're specifically doing direct preference optimization. And so in this setup, you give it the prompt, again, the exact same information. And then you're giving it a chosen response, which would be what the human actually said on their evaluation. And then the rejected response is if you take those Likert scales and you push them all up 1 point. We did this specifically because in our zero and few shot testing, we saw that that seemed to be about the difference that it was having with humans. And so we wanted to guide it to be even more specific. And then we only did if it was 1 point up because we wanted to train the model to be more conservative in its testing rather than more lenient. What we found is when we compare, so our top result from our first set of experiments with some of our supervised fine-tuning and our reinforcement learning is we found that using a large closed source model like GPT-03 Mini is still able to achieve a strong interclass correlation coefficient even when we train a smaller model. So it gets some additional benefit, but it still quite isn't able to achieve that same level of inter-rater reliability as we saw with GPT-03 Mini. Our next step is then the final one, which is looking at using multiple large language models as judges. And so our setup is using Microsoft AutoGen. Specifically, we're using the Magentic 1 group chat. And so this has one agent that is sort of the orchestrator that leads this group conversation between the agents. We used both GPT-4o and GPT-03 Mini as the orchestrator in this instance. We switched from 4o to 03 Mini just based upon during our experiments, 03 became available. And so we switched over to that since it seemed to show better performance. Then the agents that are actually included in the conversation. So we had 3 agents and they're given an agentic persona. And so this is a system prompt that passes to the large language model to tell it what to focus on when it is doing the evaluations. And so we did 2 different styles. One is 3 different types of clinicians that you would see in a hospital care setting. And so this is an analytical perfectionist, an efficient multitasker, and a collaborative team player. And so each of them are given different specifics on how to approach the conversation. And then our second set is what we call high, low, and middle scoring. And this is to specifically target the different aspects of a Likert scale. And so one that is instructed to be very lenient with the scoring, one that is instructed to be very strict with the scoring, and one that's sort of in the middle. So as an overview on how this sort of group chat works, again, we have the exact same input that we've had the entire time, the raw notes, the summary, the rubric, and then some task-specific instructions. As you can see in our original workflow with the large language model as a judge, which is here on top, it would just go to the one agent who would then produce the response. Now, instead, we're going to this multiple large language models as judges, this bottom box here, where the prompt is passed to the orchestrator, who then creates a plan for the discussion, passes it to these agents who participate in some number of rounds of discussion, which is a hyperparameter. And then once the conversation is done, the orchestrator then synthesizes over that entire discussion to produce the final output. Following our experimentation with this, we again saw that just GPT-03 Mini is still able to achieve the best inter-rater reliability with the physician ground truth. And so, which is great because just one instance of the large language model is a lot cheaper than having to do 3 instances of the large language model. But as you can see, even though the interclass correlation coefficient is a little lower, the balance of errors is a lot better. And so when we're looking at the raw difference in the Likert scales, GPT-03 Mini sees an interquartile range of 0 to 1, where the multi-agents are seeing an interquartile range of -1 to 1. And so this is a point that we're doing future work on right now, is how do we take this multi-agent workflow and push it to be even better than just that single large language model and capitalize on the fact that it's able to have a more even distribution of errors. So for this GPT-03 Mini, were we able to save any time and money? And the answer is yes. So for our human baseline, this is in seconds. So it takes approximately 600 seconds for a human to do a single evaluation. and costs an estimated $50. And so this is based on the median minimum physician consulting rate of about $300 per hour and is more of an estimate. And then GPT-03 Mini only took 16 seconds to complete a single evaluation. And because this is a closed source model, we have to take into account the API fees for asking it questions and getting responses. But we still found that for one evaluation, it only costs 2 cents to do that. So what we found for the large language model as a judge study is that we introduced an automated method to evaluate the clinical multi-document summaries using large language models. And we found that GPT-03 Mini was able to achieve a strong inter-rater reliability that was comparable to expert humans, and that these evaluations were approximately 38 times faster than doing a human review. Since we've completed this large language model as a judge study, we have applied this in a couple different other applications and are still continuing work on more external validation. But we did one cross-task application using the problem list summarization task. And so we want to determine if this large language model as a judge framework actually works using a slightly different rubric on a slightly different task. And so the problem list summarization asks a clinician to summarize the active problems of the diagnoses from the progress notes. And so they use a large language model to do the summary in order to automate that process. And then the gold standard, which they do provide, is from the plan section. And so this data is from the Mimic 3. This data set had 31 summaries with about just under 800 individual rubric scores. And then the input to the large language model as a judge is very similar to the previous task. So you have the patient note, the generated summary. Here you have a gold standard as well. And then you have the rubric that is actually for the problem list summarization, which that publication is listed at the bottom. The median length of the input to the large language model in this task is 1,606 words. And we were able to confirm high reliability even in this cross-task application. So the inter-rater reliability is slightly lower than the PDSQI-9, but it is still fairly high, as you can see on the bottom here with a 0.71. In addition to this task, the PDSQI-9 was also applied to evaluate ambient AI documentation. And so again, the publication associated with this application is listed at the bottom. But this was a 24-week stepped wedge pragmatic trial on using generative AI scribes to capture clinical conversations and draft visit notes that was done here at UW. In order to do a quality assessment of this documentation that was drafted using the generative AI scribe, the documentation was measured using the PDSQI-9 across just under 8,000 randomly sampled notes from all of the different scribes that were used. They found that the mean scores ranged from 3.97 to 4.99 across the different domains on the 5-point Likert scales. And so it showed that the PDSQI-9 could validate ambient AI and was used to show that the quality was still good while the documentation time had significantly reduced. An additional research application is on P-CREST explainability. So P-CREST is a machine learning model for the early detection of pediatric deterioration. And the goal was to add additional context to these predictions by providing a summary of the notes to the provider. So the PDSQI-9 was used to judge the summaries that were generated by Mixtral from the past 6 hours of clinical notes. And so they did LLM-as-a-Judge evaluations on almost 220,000 cases using both O3 Mini and DeepSeek in order to verify the quality of those summaries. The final application here is in the UW health system itself. And so health systems don't want to turn on some new AI solution because at the end of the day, the large language model as a judge is using a large language model in addition. And so you want to be able to monitor it. And so what UW Health found is that how do we actually go about monitoring the PDSQI-9 when it's used in production? And so a lot of the times you have to pick a bad metric or you have to slow down implementation when you add this new AI solution. But by using the PDSQI-9, they're able to at least compare apples to apples between use cases, and it's significantly more theoretically easy to implement. And so the PDSQI-9 is currently officially being used to evaluate summary use cases in production at the UW Health System. They've come across some challenges, which is also directing our future directions. And so batch processing the PDSQI-9 isn't as straightforward. And so what we're working on is how do you extract batches to process them more efficiently in the background. Additionally, you can't pass or fail a PDSQI-9 evaluation because it's a dimension evaluation that consists of Likert scales. And so what we're currently doing is making a process control chart so you can sort of see the change over time. But this is also motivating some future work we're working on thresholding the PDSQI-9. And so how do you translate that JSON list of dimensions and their scores into a single decision of pass or fail? And then additionally, we're working on extending the framework for longer summaries because we only did 3 to 5 notes that were included in the summary, where in a hospital course, you're going to have significantly more than that, as well as including the discrete data in these summaries as well. I'd like to acknowledge all of the people from the ICU Data Science Lab, which is where I come from, as well as our collaborators at UW-Madison, EPIC, and Loyola and the University of Colorado. And that is all. And so everything that I have discussed is available on our public GitLab repo, as well as the full PDSQI-9 instrument, which we implemented using REDCap. And so we provide the REDCap instrument if you want to use it. In addition, we also have some de-identified notes on there, so you can see what our notes and our summaries were looking like. And that is all.
That's great. Thank you, Emma, for this very informative and very comprehensive talk on LLMs as a judge for biomedical applications. So maybe I can start with some of the questions. There is one from the Q&A session. So how do you avoid hallucinations and bias in your outputs?
When we're generating the summaries for the evaluation, we're specifically trying to get bias and hallucinations in order to at least identify them. And so a lot of the goal here is just to identify when they occur so that researchers can then be informed when they occur to then build better AI tools that have less hallucinations and less omissions. So our goal here isn't necessarily to reduce them, it's more to identify them.
Thank you. And there's another question coming from the audience. Was there any public available benchmark data sets for clinical notes that you were able to test and validate in your study?
So the problem list summarization, the cross application is a publicly available data set because it uses Mimic 3. It was actually a shared task when they originally did it. And so that is sort of a publicly available benchmark, but a lot of the issue is that a lot of the benchmarks that currently exist out there aren't based on real AHR data, real settings. And so that's why we started from the ground up because we really wanted to see what would actually be necessary in true clinical practice rather than just like on a QA benchmark or something like that.
Makes sense. And then there's another question coming from the audience. Were the AI summaries generated solely from text, or did the model incorporate multimodal data such as images?
It is mostly based upon text at this time. We did translate some of the discrete data was turned into text and then included in the summary, but we're not doing a true multimodal where you have images and like tabular data and free text data. We're just focusing on the textual aspect at this time. But again, that is a future direction of because text is not the only form of information in the clinical setting. And so how do you actually get all of that in?
Yeah, so I think that would be a great future directions to go, especially integrating image and the structure part of the data.
Yeah.
So another question from the audience, is there a performance benchmark you are measuring AI versus human in the loop, and maybe a combination of cost, time, and accuracy?
Yeah, so I didn't include it here just for the sake of time, but we did some additional analyses we did analyses where you're looking at does the large language model agree with a human? And so that's just sort of a 1v1. We're also looking at if you use the large language model as a one rater among many. And so if instead of 7 humans, you have 6 humans and one LLM, does that degrade the quality of the evaluation? And so does that cause the inter-rater reliability to go down significantly? And then we also looked at if you just add it as an 8th reviewer. And so if you increase the rater pool, again, does that make your inter-rater reliability go down significantly at all? And so we wanted to look at this from a whole bunch of different dimensions. And then I only included 2 metrics on here, but we also did multiple different metrics. And so not just interclass correlation coefficient, but we're also looking at kappa scores, the Cronbach's alpha, the Krippendorf's alpha, in order to get a full dimension, because not one metric is really going to be perfect. But if you look across all of them, you'll at least be able to see the trends.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's a follow-up question from the audience, and I think I mean, it appears there is some typo, but I think what they were asking is why you did not use scores like blue or perplexity or rouge.
Yeah. So those are the type of metrics that I would classify as traditional automated metrics. And so we did prior work before this study looking at when does those Rouge or BERT score evaluations, if they correlate at all with the human evaluation, and found that that was not the case. Because one of the issues with those metrics are mostly looking at either n-gram overlap, and so they're doing word matching between some ground truth and the summary itself. So first, you actually have to have a ground truth to even compare summary v summary, and then or they're looking at sort of a similarity metric, and so they're looking at if it's using similar words. The issues in both of these cases is that the different healthcare systems, different clinicians might use slightly different verbiage. And so they could say heart attack, or they could say MI, or they could spell myocardial infarction out. So it is very, very different. And so you don't want to necessarily have the summary be penalized for slightly different wording when they do mean the same thing. On the other side, you don't want it to get positive results for similar words that clinically mean very different things. So bacterial and viral might have a similarity score that's pretty close, but those two things mean very different contexts in clinical practice. And so those metrics have a lot of sort of known issues that they're not necessarily able to grasp the full clinical context. And so that's why they're not included here, is based upon prior work sort of ruling them out as a good way to go.
That's great insights, and it's always fun to delve into those NLP mechanisms and the scores and talk about their pros and cons. And there's another question from the audience. So, if you were to operationalize this, would you imagine leveraging the summarizing feature that is baked into the EHR, or and then running the model alongside to evaluate the result?
Yes, so that is the end goal. And so what they're currently doing at the sort of UW health system behind the scenes is that automatic summarization is generating the summaries, and then they're selecting some subset, testing those using the PDSQI-9 to validate the quality, and then pushing them back out. And so the purpose of generating the summaries in the course of our study itself was because we wanted to make sure that we were getting both good and bad summaries, because we wanted to test the whole rubric, so the whole dimension. Because as we see with many large language models, is they're very good at least being very using language very well. They can be very succinct. They can be very thorough. So we want to make sure that we had ones that were also bad quality, because that helps you have a better sort of idea when you're doing these inter-rater reliability metrics, is you want to have a good distribution across these 5-point Likert scales. And so the summaries, we just generated them in order to have data that was both good and bad.
And when you have both the good and bad summaries, are the bad summaries also fed into the loop so that it keeps improving how the model judges?
We did not do that in this particular study because our goal wasn't to improve the large language model doing the summary. It was just to improve the large language model doing the evaluation of the
Mhm.
summary. And so there's a slight bit of nuance there. But but that could be a point for future work is if somebody wanted to take that score and then use that in some sort of reinforcement learning to pass back to the large language model to improve its summaries. But we didn't necessarily explore that here since the goal wasn't to have good summaries, it was to have good evaluations.
Cool. And then another question from the audience. Did you see any difference in specialties such as dermatology versus neurology regarding data accuracy and quality using these tools? And was telescope data part of your study? And besides cost of reviewing, do you feel this would help a practice seeing more patients?
So we did look at if there was any sort of difference in the reliability of the evaluation across the different specialties, and we didn't see any sort of significance there. We also looked at across if we had the information on the patient population, we looked across that as well, just to make sure that there wasn't any sort of like in for this specialty, the evaluation is always slightly less reliable. So we found that that was consistent. In terms of if you're thinking about in clinical practice, I myself am not a clinician, so I can't completely speak to whether that could save time. The goal would be that it would, because you now have a sort of way to actually verify that the summary is reliable. And so those summaries, I would think would be able to help, but I think that would might be a question more for a clinician and their particular workflow.
And another question from the audience, can you improve the performance as an agentic AI by using an A2A architecture?
So we're currently working on if that is possible, because there is still some area of improvement, especially when you're thinking about sort of more and more complex tasks. Like again, if you're adding in that multimodal data, that becomes more and a more complex task. And so our goal is to explore how to sort of leverage these agentic workflows a little bit better in order to improve the quality of the evaluation even more. Um, so yeah, so that's an area for future work and it's something that we're actively working on.
That's cool and very cool. I see that we just had a lot of questions that comes from the audience, and I think those touches both on the core NLP part and some touched on the operationalization part, and also even touching on the cost and the resources needed to run those uh, evaluation tools. And so, what are your like next steps in general in terms of pushing forward the field, and both from the methodology developing point of view and also from operationalization point of view, better integration with the clinical workflows?
Mhm. So we have one major project which is working on external validation, and so we did all this work at UW Health, but we want to make sure that that translates outside of UW Health and in a different patient population. And so we're currently working on some external validation that is happening at other sites and on slightly different tasks. So maybe more like a discharge summary rather than a multi-document summarization. In addition to that, we're thinking about how do you take this sort of suite of scores, which you could say are maybe more researchy in the dimensions of where exactly it's failing, and translate that into a pass or fail sort of decision. And then how does that inform how so this was all done in conjunction with Epic. They were a major part of this entire project, and they provide this tool on their open source set of evaluation instruments and are using it. And so the goal is both from like you have sort of the vendor side and then you have sort of the health system side. And so we're using both of them right now. And so the vendor side then has a way to validate their summaries before they're then providing that tool to health systems. And then you also have health systems have a way to validate tools that are coming from different vendors. And so when you're looking at sort of in the workflow view, instead of this being something that like the clinician would say, evaluate this summary, this is something that the AI like so at UW Health, we have a set of physicians who look at the AI and really figure out what is useful, what is not useful, how do we implement this into workflows. And so those would be the people who would sort of be getting these raw numbers and determining when it would be helpful, when it wouldn't be helpful, when do we push this into operation, when do we not, and really answering sort of those operational issues and determining what maybe specialties would benefit, what departments in their healthcare system would benefit. There is some amount of resource requirement in the sense that you have to be able to run a large language model, which for some healthcare systems that are maybe smaller or less resource could become an issue. And so that's the goal in terms of having also the vendor being able to do these evaluations on their back end. And so you have some sort of quality metric that you can use. Because for running models, we're again doing all of this in a HIPAA compliant manner. So we didn't have to de-identify the notes at all. Where if you weren't able to do that, then you might have to pass through some sort of de-identification workflow to then run your notes through things, which adds an additional layer of complexity.
Yeah, so I mean, talking about the identification, it totally adds another layer of complexity, and then which could even affect the accuracy of the evaluation. And in terms of the adoption, you mentioned different specialties, and so do you observe that some specialties tend to be the early adopters, and versus the others tend to wait out and see, I mean, especially see others' experiences?
I am not necessarily seeing that data, and so I can't really speak to that. That would be more a question for one of the people in the healthcare system who is on sort of that AI team and is doing that implementation. Generally, it would mostly be the specialties. Well, first of all, you have the specialties who are relying on multimodal data, and so that's a whole different sort of beast. And so they're probably not having that adoption quite as early because you have to think about, well, how am I including these images and how am I including all this discrete data that they use? But you're also thinking of the factor of sort of time. And so who needs to be moving the fastest is probably where you're going to see the most movement on um, where we really, really, really need to be saving time. And so that might be something like the emergency department compared to maybe in in an outpatient setting, they might slightly be less resourced, and so they aren't as worried about implementing these tools quite as fast.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I want to give a final chance for the audience to raise questions. And in the meantime, that I also wanted to express my gratitude for you to come and present to us the state of the artwork that you have been leading. And so we are all very inspired. So I didn't see further questions coming from the audience. So in that case, thank you again, Emma, and we'll reconvene in a couple of weeks. The audience, please stay tuned for our future upcoming events.
Thank you so much for having me and for all the great questions.